Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. And my guest this segment is Russ Winter. He is the host of Winter Watch. Russ brought to my attention this book, which he's written a review of, called Red Symphony, which was published in the 1930s. And it just gives some great insight into this sort of international, what can only be described as a conspiracy on the part of very wealthy and well-connected people to foment revolution, war, depression, and all the rest. And it's from the direct testimony of someone who had participated in that. It's amazing to me and to you, Russ, that this book is still available at Amazon.com. But let's go right to it. Why don't you give us a little bit of background on what Red Symphony is all about?
Yeah, you gave a good synopsis there. The book was actually published in the 1960s, so I'm going to give you the background of the book. The Dr. Lebowski was a physician in the Soviet Union. He worked for the NKVD, and he was called upon in January 1938 to interview, witness, and record an interrogation of an important Trotskyite and Soviet official, Christian G. Rakovsky.
Yes.
This is during the trial of the Trotskyites, and Rakovsky was one of the founders of Soviet Bolshevism. He was a close ally of Trotsky, not Stalin, but Trotsky. He was a Trotskyite.
Mm-hmm.
The first chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Ukrainian SSR. He was a Soviet ambassador to both the UK and France. And Dr. Rakovsky later compiled his record in French. So they did the interview in French, and then they translated it into Russian. But Rakovsky was so taken with this extraordinary interview that he copied it and kept a copy for himself. And the document was discovered during World War II in a cottage near Leningrad by a soldier fighting for the Spanish Legion during World War II. And it eventually was translated in Spanish and published in a book called Red Symphony in the 1960s. Now, I was kind of curious, because the obvious reaction to a book like this, especially when we go into some of the details, is that it's a hoax. And it may well be, but if it's a hoax, it's pretty extraordinary document.
Well, before we get into the actual document, which is really interesting, I think that it's safe to say that this issue has been covered by other important scholars. One that comes to mind is Dr. Anthony Sutton from this Hoover Institute, who wrote two books, one called The Wall Street and Hitler, and the other being Wall Street and the Bolsheviks. And some of the material that he uncovers in those books are similar enough to the testimony of Dr. Rakovsky in this book, Red Symphony, and there are many other sources as well. So anyway, but let's talk about Dr. Rakovsky's testimony.
Well, people have tried to debunk the book, but I've noticed the debunking is pretty weak, and it doesn't really. I mean, one of the things they did is they looked at some of the language that Rakovsky was using, and he used the term British Commonwealth. He goes, oh well, there was no British Commonwealth in 1938. Well, there was.
Sure.
Just go to Wikipedia, and the term British Commonwealth of Nations was used starting in 1925. So that's just very weak attempts to debunk, which always kind of makes me laugh. I think it's a pretty extraordinary document. It fits in well with kind of my research that I've done. So yeah, let's get into it. So to facilitate the interrogation, Rakovsky gave Rakovsky a wonder drug, probably meth. That's my guess. He called it an enlightened stimulant. And Rakovsky was described as an expert conversationalist. His speech was exact, elegant, even decorative. The interrogation was recorded in an apparatus hidden behind a wall. Afterward, got a truck coming through.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Afterwards, Rakovsky translated into Russian, made two copies, one for Stalin, and they told Rakovsky, just give us the truth. because the public is never going to see this interview. This is for Stalin's eyes only, for the intelligence of Stalin. So Rutkowski did exactly that. So the prisoner Rutkowski, whose Jewish birth name was changed from Rockhauser, was also a Bulgarian official of Komintern and a Rothschild Warburg agent and ally, like I said, of Trotsky, not Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
He survived the 38 purge, but was likely executed on September 11th, 1941, along with other political prisoners for defeatist agitation and Medvedev Forest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the interrogation began. He says, now we're concerned, this is page 10. So I've just taken, there's 58 pages, and I've just taken what I thought were interesting extracts out of it, which we can go over. Now we're concerned with the real truth, Kusman, who was the interrogator, said. Not the official truth. The demands of international politics was force us to hide the whole truth, the real truth, adding that Stalin must also know the real truth. Rutkowski explained with great insight just how he and why the international bankers were behind international communism, and Leon Trotsky in particular. After Stalin ousted Trotsky, the bankers made moves to counter Stalinist communist nationalism, and Red Symphony states that Jewish financiers were promoting real communism and not Stalin's Bonapartism.
Right.
And by the way, one of the debunks of this book is that it was a Spanish fascist that found the document. Well, the document doesn't go easy on Hitler at all. It's kind of damning for Hitler. It damns a lot of people. It's kind of in this grand conspiracy, really. So that's kind of a weak refute. It sort of shows that people didn't really read the whole context of the entire document, even as it pertained to Hitler. Not friendly to Hitler at all.
All right. Let me just interject here a little bit. When he talks about the Jewish financiers, we're talking about what has been called the R crowd banking families, most of whom are American. Includes the Schiffs, the Warburgs, and their agents from the Rothschild banking family. And I want to be very careful here to point out that these private banking families were also very enmeshed with the kind of the WASP establishment, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Harrimans, and the Brown brothers, and a lot of other long-time mainline American wealth centers.
Yeah,
and
the war business.
that so we have to be careful
we're
not
in the war
to
business.
to view this as a Jewish thing. I mean, there were certainly Jews involved, probably Catholic bankers as well. Like, I mean, the founder of Bank of America was a Catholic Italian family, and that there was this general trend on their part, particularly as it accelerated in the late 19th century, to promote international, I guess you, for lack of a better word, international government. I mean, or international governance, to transcend borders. And it was done partially for financial reasons, because they wanted to gather the power of money into their hands. And when I say money, I'm not just talking personal wealth. We're talking about the ability to create money, which is what central bankers do. And that this was an enormous power, eventually coming to fruition in the United States in 1913 with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis. Actually, I think the connection is even more tied in with the British bankers, what I call the pederast bankers.
Okay.
Pedophiles and pederasts.
No, that's all right.
That's been some very interesting research that I've done. It's often a completely different track. I mean, we could talk about Lord. I mean, he actually mentioned some of these guys. Like
Milner's Kindergarten.
Right.
And Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Roundtable Group and all of them.
It just seems like they're these sort of like sick, satanic warmongers. That's how I would describe them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And whether they're in the U.S., whether in this Jewish group, there is a tendency to just blame it all on Jewish conspiracy. There is definitely a Jewish conspiracy, no question, but it's multifaceted, definitely. So
right. Well, I mean, I view it as sort of transcending any particular religious affiliation. It goes into almost an informal, an informal kind of international theocracy that is it rejects Judaism, Christianity. I mean, we're talking about very amoral people who generally are, I would argue, anti-God. I mean, they want to create some kind of a world order, and they're utopians. It goes back to the Illuminati, really, in the modern times, which was a reaction to in Catholic Europe, and in Judaism. I think Judaism was very seriously corrupted by this false Messiah movement of the 17th century. I mean, we could get into the history of this corruption, but suffice to say that by the late 19th century, early 20th century, you had an establishment that was made up again of Jews, Christians, that transcended religion. I mean, they were at war with religion. They wanted to create a new religion.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. So continue on here. The general tenor of Rakowski's remarks is that usury capitalism and terroristic communism are both tools of the same forces serving the same purpose and masters. To wit, the financier is just as international as the communist. And I think that's important today to realize, because yes. It's a dialectic that's been set up to try to divert attention away from the bankster element, what I would call the bankster element, the control.
I would agree.
Both with the help of differing pretexts and differing meanings, a struggle with the national bourgeois state and deny it. There's a clear similarity individually between communist internationalists and financial cosmopolitans. As a natural result, there is the same similarity between communist international and financial international. Rakowski bluntly reveals the source of the financial cosmopolitans' mythical power. They acquired for themselves the real privilege of coining money. And that's a lot of what our world is about today. That's what concentrates the power.
No, I mean, he points it out very well. And I think also we need to realize that the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848, and of which Marx was hired by this very shadowy group called the League of the Just. There were a lot of theories of who they were. Eventually, they changed their name to the Communist League. And I think that we could theorize that they might have been an offshoot of the Bavarian Illuminati, but we don't know that. It doesn't really matter. The point is that this pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, which sort of serves as almost as a constitution for this conspiracy, one of the planks calls for central banking. People don't realize that. They think that the central banking is a classic example of capitalism and freedom, but it's not. It is essentially the transfer of the ability to create currency into the hands of these private bankers. The Federal Reserve Bank is a private institution. It's not part of the government. Our government does not actually create our money. I mean, and should be creating our money interest-free, or whatever interest is developed, it should go to the people of America and used to improve our country, not to a cartel of private, domestic, and international bankers and businessmen, which is the way the system is set up now. It's very corrupt.
Well, the other
and
thing
it's also very unconstitutional, because the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, says that Congress shall coin currency and regulate the value thereof, which means that Congress, our representatives in our government, are supposed to create our currency based upon our needs, not transfer that power to this cartel of private bankers and investors, which is exactly what happened in the year 1913 with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act.
Well, and the other thing about Karl Marx is that all the dialectics he sets up nothing regarding to money power, banking power. He doesn't even deal with it.
He wants the central bank. I mean, he viewed that, and you point this out in your article, Russ, and I think Red Symphony points it out. that power to control money is a lien on the property of every single citizen. I mean, it's the value. It controls the working man's dollar, and that this is a revolutionary power. It's one that can be used to break people. It's one that could be used to consolidate economic power into the hands of a few elites, and that's exactly what they intended to do.
Yep. So that nails it. You're on a roll, Charles.
Maybe
Anyway,
too good a roll. I don't know.
Yeah, a great part of the money circulating, money for big affairs, as representative of all national money, yes, money, is being issued by those few people about whom I had hinted. Banks, stock exchanges, and the whole world financial system is a gigantic machine for the purpose of bringing about quote-unquote unnatural scandals. Rokowski made it clear that the more well-known figures among the financial internationalists, the bankers and politicians are only men of straw fronts.
Mm-hmm.
But when queried about who they are, he offered up a list and a caveat that sitting in prison, he didn't have access to his card index. It's kind of funny.
Oh, that's a good one.
He qualified that he had an intimate time reference of 1917, which is, of course, a key year, and said, understand that they are not a state. They are which the international was before 1917. He mentioned Walter Rathenau, Rathenau, 1867 and 1922, as an intermediary with whom both he and Trotsky had hands-on dealings. Rathenau was a German Weimar foreign minister and a Jewish internationalist. Before he was assassinated, he was a top-ranked Illuminist. Afterwards, the crime, I call it the crime syndicate, shifted gear back to the use of fronts rather than top kingpins. Now, Rathenau is kind of the one that the right wing in Germany in the 1920s called the stab in the back. That's the main stab in the back guy.
That's partially because Rathenau, shortly before his assassination, had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, and that treaty eventually was used by the Nazis quietly as a means for them to build up their armaments and their military power. And it became more out in the open, of course, with the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939. But going back a little bit in history here, the year the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, who was the first president in American history who was a socialist and who thought in a way differently than every other president before him. His vision of America, as he wrote about in books while he was still an intellectual back in the late 19th century, was that America would become a socialist appendage of a world socialist movement. This is very different than every other American president and the American way of thinking. And in his year, not only did he sign the Federal Reserve Act, which transferred the ability to coin money to this private syndicate, but he also signed the Income Tax Act, which directly taxed citizens. And as part of that act, he created the tax loophole for nonprofits and foundations so that these wealthy Americans could park their money without having to worry about taxes and give jobs to their various friends and use the funds to buy influence in terms of changing the American culture, changing the way Americans think about themselves by investing in leftist ideas and institutions. It should also be noted that shortly after the Federal Reserve Act was signed in Christmas Eve of 1913, within months, World War I broke out in Europe. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I mean, I have no idea, but that broke out. The United States involvement in it was something that is a very shady deal. We should never have been involved in that war. And then, of course, you had Trotsky in New York getting suitcases filled with cash from various financiers, including Jacob Schiff, and going off to Leningrad, where he met up with Lenin and set up what became the Bolshevik state.
Yeah, Rokowski doesn't talk about Wilson, but clearly Wilson was a key player. I mean, he was compromised. I'm not exactly sure what his exact role was, but they controlled him. They can't control it through compromise. And we're kind of seeing that even today, with the Epstein stuff going on.
Yeah, let me just comment a little on that, because I think that you're bringing up a very interesting point, because a lot of times people in high positions of power, like Wilson, are extremely ambitious people who would do almost anything to get there. They feel almost this messianic drive to change the world, and that, yeah, they're often blackmailed. There's something in their past. I think in the case of Wilson, it was an extramarital affair that they had evidence of, and that they use that as a way to control them. It's a kind of an informal sort of a blackmail, and I think you find this phenomena oftentimes with people in positions of great power, that they're being
Yeah,
blackmailed. They
they
compromise
usually
to
bring
get.
in one of their and they usually bring one of their agents, in this case, a British agent, Colonel House, to
Yes,
run this, run the operation. So that's your British, what I call pederast connection. We could go
yes.
down that path someday. But I'm
That's a whole
convinced it's
different show.
yeah, a whole different show. But I'm convinced now it's pretty real. I mean, it's been
Yes,
long lasting. It goes back centuries.
absolutely.
From the days of the
Goes
what do
back
they
to
call it?
Babylon.
Back to Babylon. Okay.
Anyway, so Russ, back to the Red Symphony. So you have this testimony from Rakowski, who was an insider, who would be executed by the Stalinists, who was pro-Trotsky. Trotsky would be executed, for that matter. Most of the early Bolsheviks were executed by Stalin. But he talked
Yeah, they
about how these international financiers had helped the Bolsheviks take over Russia. He also talks about how they helped Adolf Hitler take over Germany. So talk about that.
okay. Well, let's see. Let's just go on. He says something about Roosevelt. He was asked about him. He says Roosevelt is one of the. Ask if Roosevelt is one of them. He replies, I don't know if he's one of them or is only subject to them. So there's what we were just talking about. He says, what more do you want? But I think he was conscious of his mission. So okay, let's go on. He talks about the different anchors involved, about names of them, 12.5 names, which you can read. Well-known ones: Schiff, Warburg, Loeb, Kuhn. He dwells on who is in charge. He says it's a well-known fact that Marx and the highest chiefs of the First International, already the open one, and among them Herzen and Hein, were controlled by Baron Lionel Rothschild, whose revolutionary portrait was done by Disraeli. Have you ever looked at Disraeli's book on
Right, Lord
encoding?
Porninsby.
Have you looked at that? That's pretty
It's a
remarkable.
fictional account, they say, of the life of Lord Lionel Rothschild.
Yeah, written by the Prime Minister Disraeli, who knew him well. So interesting that he would write a fictional account describing this guy. And he said he was the character of Sidonia, a man who, according to the story, was a multimillionaire, knew and controlled spies, Carbonari, Freemasons, secret Jews, gypsies, revolutionists, areas, etc., etc. Marx avoided dealing with banking power. Okay, we already covered that.
Right, exactly.
So Sidonia is an idealized portrait of the son of Nathan Rothschild. And I have an article that I've written on that, The Hidden World of Benjamin Disraeli, a made man and opportunist. So it's funny how I just kind of have these articles that I can kind of tie into this when I find this. I have the background. So if you want to read these background articles, go to the main article I have up on this topic that I put up this week.
Yes, on Winter Watch.
Rakowski says, quote, remember the phrase of the mother of the 5 Rothschild brothers: if my sons want it, there will be no war. This means that they were the arbitrators, the masters of peace and war, but not emperors. Are you capable of visualizing the fact of such a cosmic importance? Is not war already a revolutionary function? War, the commune, since that time, every war was a giant step towards communism. Statements from Leon Trotsky and himself and from Rakowski suggest that socialism and central banking is the banker's favorite tool to increase government power, because the socialist state requires massive centralization. When something is centralized and top heavy, it is easy to control if you can put your man at its head. With the exile of Trotsky in 1929, Rakowski became the acknowledged leader of the left opposition inside the Soviet Union. Okay, so Trotsky himself acknowledged the role of Freemasonry. I mean, whoever wrote this book, God, they had the research down.
They had the inside track, that's for sure.
Yeah, Trotsky freely acknowledged the role of Freemasonry and Illuminism in his book My Life, The Rise and Fall of a Dictator in 1930. He says, page 29, it was during that period that I became interested in Freemasonry. This is Trotsky. In the 18th century, Freemasonry became expressive of a militant policy of enlightenment, as in the case of the Illuminati, who were the forerunners of the revolution, and its left is culminated by the Carbonari Freemasons, counted among their members both Louis XVI and Dr. Guillotine, who invented the guillotine. In southern Germany, Freemasonry assumed an open revolutionary character, whereas at the court of Catherine the Great, it was a masquerade reflecting the aristocratic and bureaucratic hierarchy. A Freemason, Nikovov, was exiled to Siberia by a Freemason empress. So Trotsky's kind of a ramble. He has a rambling writing style, but he's got gems in there. Trotsky in his autobiography tells of, okay, now we're going to get down to the revolution, financing the revolution. Let's get this nailed. Trotsky in his autobiography tells of a British finance gave him quote a large loan to be repaid after Arsen D. Golovich, who witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution firsthand, had identified both the name of the financier and the amount of the loan. In private interviews, he said, I have been told that over 21 million rubles was spent by Lord Alfred Milner.
Oh, the Milner kindergarten. Yep.
So they've got their little claws in this. And they're
allied. Let's just point out that is the same establishment that was Dr. Carol Quigley talks about in his book Tragedy and Hope, which I have on my wall here, and which set up eventually the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House in London, and the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And that these two think tanks made up of these establishment types are promoting international order and world government. I mean, there's really no other way to describe it.
And war.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the big element. It's very costly wars that sort of hold mankind back, or hold at least Western, really the whole world. I don't think they want humanity advancing. It's sort of a satanic mission.
Oh yeah, I mean we're dealing with it right now to bring things to today with these communist revolutions in American cities to stop Donald Trump, in my opinion. They're looting black businesses, they're burning black neighborhoods, they're killing black people, all in the name of trying to create a race war. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that George Soros, who is very much is cut of the same cloth as these international bankers, gave this group called Black Lives Matter $27 million to start as seed money. I mean, this is the same agitation now going on in this country, in American cities, and the way it's covered by the media, as occurred with the Bolshevik seizure of Russia, with the Nazi seizure of Germany. Yeah,
that's why I thought the discussion of this book was particularly timely, because it's exactly what you just said. Okay, so I discussed this whole Milner racket posse. He's got his warmonger extraordinaire, Alfred Harmsworth, a.k.a. Lord Northcliffe, big warmonger that pushed Britain hard in World War I. And Cecil Rhodes and his warmongering buggery hegemony. Snappy titles, but whatever. People might dismiss that, but read it before you dismiss it.
Sure.
Rokowski pointed out the elite bankers magically avoided the Marxist revolutionary bloodbaths of the 20th century, which terrorized every other sector of the so-called bourgeoisie, from shopkeepers to peasants plowing their own land. But not the bankers, no. Rokowski reveals connections of Trotsky through his wife to Jewish elite international bankers. The primary text on Trotsky and the Russian Revolution is well covered in Richard Spence's book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. 1905, 1925. There's a real good interview there on Tim Kelly's show where he covers kind of like a 3-hour interview with Spence, who covers a lot of this quite well. I put up a condensed post on this about firebrand Bolshevik Leon Trotsky, fully backed by international banksters and the pederast British War Party. Per Rokovsky, together with him, there arrives in Russia his wife, Savoa. Do you know who she is?
I'd not heard of her, no.
She's associated with Civil Tovsky, who's partners of Jacob Schiff financial group, which, as I said, had financed the revolution in 1905. So 1905 is kind of where they got the start. But here's the reason why Trotsky, in one move, moved to the top of the revolutionary list. Now, it's really interesting that Netflix did a series called Trotsky. You see it?
I've not, no.
They go into all this where he kind of meets his wife, who turns out to be his second cousin, actually. And his first cousin is this Zivkovsky. He meets them in Paris. And it kind of makes it look like some kind of like an accident, something organic. It kind of lied about the real story here, but it portrayed the story. It was kind of interesting, but it confused it. Just confused it. As far as Trotsky's ties to the world financial leader concerned, they were well known long before the publication of Red Symphony. In 1919, the French government received from its informer in Washington a detailed report where Red Leon's New York banker sponsors were listed. It was noted that Trotsky established his connection with the financiers after his marriage to Natalia Savoa, the daughter of Abram Zivanovsky, and both of them were in that Netflix series. If you can watch that episode, try to figure it out. They don't make it easy.
Oh yeah, right. But they scramble it, but they put it out there.
Right.
It's interesting. That's sort of like the way that, I don't know if you saw the Netflix series on Jeffrey Epstein, but it had a similar kind of thing where they did drop out certain truths or put them in, but they did it in a context that gave a different impression than what was really going on.
So anyway, Spence gets into this Zivostowski, who's Trotsky's uncle, as a main player. I cut out a little section. I won't go into that. Okay, let's talk about Hitler.
Yes.
Or you want to go to the Bolshevik Revolution first?
Well, yeah, let's finish that one up. Yep.
Okay, let's go to the Bolshevik Revolution. I got a little bit out of order in my article, but series of organized defeats in World War I led to the revolution. Revkowski says that Alexander Kerensky was the key collaborator of Trotsky. He was a puppet. His job was to fold his tent. Probably like Joe Biden coming up.
Sure, good comparison. Yeah,
placeholder. So Kerensky was to surrender the state fully to communism, which he did. Trotsky has the chance in an unnoticed manner to occupy the whole state apparatus. What a strange blindness. Well, that is the reality of the much praised October Revolution. The Bolsheviks took that which they gave them. You dare say that, so the interrogator says, you dare say that Kerensky was a collaborator of Lenin? Of Lenin, no. Of Trotsky, yes. It is more correct to say a collaborator of them. Believe me, despite the statues in the mausoleum, communism is indebted to Kerensky much more than to Lenin. Yes, to me, that is quite clear. Understand that I personally took part in all this. So they just get the head of the snake. They get control of the head of the snake. That's how these guys operate. It's not the complete opposite of democracy. Just flipped on its side. Do you know who financed the October Revolution? They financed it, particularly those same bankers who financed Japan in 1905. Now, I wrote an article about David Cameron. You know who David Cameron's great-grandfathers were?
Right. Weren't they like British bankers or something?
Yeah, one suspected Jewish banker, and one of them was a Scottish, British, probably pederast banker,
Wow.
the war party. And that, where did David Cameron come from? What a coinky dink. That's a historical fact
Sure.
that people just conveniently overlook. Jaw dropping when I found this out. There's photographs of them, these two guys together. And they put the package together for the Japanese to finance war against Russia.
Well, I think it's not even a secret at all that Jacob Schiff did help finance Japan in the Russia-Japanese War, and helped instigate that war, which Russia lost, and which was a humiliation and defeat for Tsar Nicholas II, who and also he had to deal with a domestic revolution at the same time. And his response was to contract the writing of that infamous forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, I studied that book as part of a book I wrote, actually. And I think that it tries to blame some deep Jewish conspiracy, and it uses words that you would think this was something to do with some rabbis in Prague. But the truth of the matter is that book is a very good description of the very conspiracy that we're talking about right now, which is not particularly Jewish at all, but which is made up of the very people we're talking about, the people that Disraeli was talking about in his fictional book, Dear Mr. Coningsby, or whatever he called it. And this is really if you look at the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in that context, it's almost like a blueprint it's similar to the Communist Manifesto. It's a blueprint for world communist government.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of, particularly when you read it 100 years later, you can kind of see this stuff.
Oh yeah.
It's more of a methodology book.
It's true.
Anyway, so he kind of goes into the Russo-Japanese War, kind of the same. We got that pretty much covered. Who arranged it? Page 29. The same people who succeeded that Lenin passed through Germany. Yes, they were able to get defeatist Trotsky out of a Canadian camp to England and send him on to Russia, giving him the chance to pass freely through all the Allied controls. Others of them, a certain Rathenau, so he pegs it on Rathenau. He's the guy that got Lenin through Germany. What a coinky dink.
Oh yeah, Lenin. I think it was Churchill who pointed out that Lenin, it was like sending a bacillus, like a disease, on a sealed train from Switzerland to Leningrad, to Finland Station, as they call it, right through Germany in the middle of World War I. The Germans had a motive in terms of wanting to have a separate peace with Russia, which they did get at a very good advantage to them, so they could focus on the Western Front. But nevertheless, it's an interesting story. There were a lot of different motives for that. And what it did was it set up Lenin in Leningrad, or in what was then Petersburg.
Right. And Rathenau says, if you undertake the study of history of the Revolution and Civil War without prejudices and use all your inquiring capabilities, what you will know is how to apply to things much less important and less obvious, then you will study informations in their totality and also study separate details right up to the anecdotal happenings. You will meet with a whole series of amazing chances. And then there's a pretty good little movie called The Fall of Eagles about steel train. And there's a scene. There's a scene where Kaiser Wilhelm is having a tizzy fit, right? Mm-hmm. They had to he was the big obstacle to get this train through, because he says, "What are you?
Are you crazy? Yeah.
We're going to get these Bolsheviks are liable to get in power, and then we're going to be dealing with it in the next generation."
Very prophetic of him.
Right. So he reluctantly signed off, and he's got this foul look on his face through this entire movie. And it kind of emerges really as the hero, but kind of as a coward in a way. Couldn't stand up to his minister.
I think also, just as a little historical footnote, that Woodrow Wilson at that point was virulently anti-Bolshevik, and that he had a falling out with Edward Mandell House and had fired him. And he really saw the whole story, but unfortunately, it was a little too late, because at that point he had a stroke, and that he was no longer able to function.
Right, and then his wife kind of took over. And so I'll tell you, his
Took
wife
over.
is actually a hero. She's a heroine. She's a
She
heroine.
was, and she was
She
a good
was.
conservative. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
she kept
Edith
all
Galt
the
Wilson. Mm-hmm.
vagabundos away. Yeah, kept all the vagabundos away. Separated house, but the damage has already been done,
That's right.
and of course, then Wilson was kind of ineffective in terms of the post-war construct. He had solid ideas on it, but just.
Well, I mean, it's a tragic story in that he seemed to have become aware of what was going on, but it was too late. He was too enmeshed in it.
Right.
And in
Okay,
a way, I think the same thing happened to Franklin Roosevelt. But
so Lenin arrives in Petrograd, and he's openly received by Lenin. He says, "As you sufficiently know, during the interval between the two revolutions, there have been deep differences between Trotsky and Lenin. All is forgotten, and Trotsky emerges as the master of his trade in the matter of the triumph of the revolution, whether Stalin wants this or not. Why? The secret is known to the wife of Lenin, Krupskaya. She knows who Trotsky is, in fact, and it is she who persuades Lenin to receive Trotsky. If he had not received him, then Lenin would have remained blocked up in Switzerland. This alone had been for him a serious reason. In addition, he knew that Trotsky provided money and helped get the colossal international assistance. A proof of this was the sealed train." So that's what Rukowski said about that whole operation. Amazing.
Yes, very, very prophetic, as it were.
Okay,
and,
so now he talks about. Go ahead.
No, I mean, who was it that wrote the book, The Red Curtain? It was actually, his name escapes me right now. I should look it up because he went on to become like a popular playwright, and he sort of distanced himself from the book. But it talks about some of the American figures involved in helping the Soviets after the end of World War II advance across Eastern Europe, take over China. People like Averell Harriman and some of these big doyens of the establishment. I know we're getting a little beyond it, but it's sort of post-war. But it clearly was not an accident that right after the war, you had one of the two Axis powers, that being the Soviet Union, moving in basically and occupying almost a third of the surface of this planet by the year 1950.
Yeah, including most of Eastern and Central Europe, where I live now. It's just.
Not to mention China and Vietnam and Korea, and I mean it was Africa. I mean it just kept on the move. It didn't happen by accident.
Yeah, they set a lot of that up through the Hitler operation. So let's go into that. Rukowski reveals that Wall Street signaled and gave financial support to Adolf Hitler personally at a crucial moment in July 1929, with the stated motive they told Hitler that, well, we just want to restore the balance of power against France and get you back in business economically. That's the storyline they gave Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what they told Hitler. It was not revealed to Hitler that Paul Warburg was behind the support, nor did Hitler even ask. He just accepted the considerable largesse that put his party over the top, right at a crucial time, right when the Depression was about to hit. He just gets larded up with money and is able to support his stormtroopers and SS guys through get them over the top at a crucial moment in time in the politics of Germany as the Depression hit. Rukowski, in direct negotiations with Hitler, they agreed as to the financing of the National Socialist Party and later received a couple $1 million sent to it from Wall Street and millions of marks from German financiers to the Freemason Schacht, which was Hitler's economic minister.
Schacht, yeah. Hallmark Schacht. Mm-hmm.
The upkeep of the SA and the SAS and the financing of the elections that took place would ultimately set Hitler into power. The interrogator asked, and Hitler believed it? Rofsky, we do not know. That's not so important, whether he did or did not believe our explanation. Our aim was to provoke a war, and Hitler was war. Do you now understand?
Mhm.
Every sincere communist, imitating his idol Lenin and the greatest revolutionary strategist, must always wish for war. Nothing is so effective in bringing near the victory of revolution as war. This is Marxist-Leninist dogma, which you must preach. Pretty successful operation in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the communists supported Hitler's entrance into power. They voted for him. Hitler himself, there's a good deal of evidence, was a communist before World War One. In fact, they say that's why he never was promoted beyond corporal, even though he actually had a pretty good war record, because he had, you know, he was on lists as being a communist. That after he came to power during the purge, what they call the Night of the Thousand Knives, when all of his enemies were arrested and many executed, including apparently some of his high school teachers, he had his records completely destroyed in Vienna. And, you know, there's a good deal of other things. I wrote about this in my book, Was Hitler a Leftist? That Hitler was originally a communist, and that National Socialism was always a kind of a step in that direction. It was a way to nationalize the country, as in a way in accord with the Communist Manifesto, which calls for revolution to be adapted to the conditions of a particular nation or culture that's being targeted, and to shapeshift itself in a way as to concentrate power, and then in the future move in the direction of this, whatever, this vague international ant colony that they seek.
Right, right. My impression of Hitler, and I think everybody should actually, what they should do. There was an audio version of Mein Kampf, which one winter I actually listened to the entire thing. I wanted to find out, you know, what's in this guy's head, and I came away with a feeling that he's an occultist. He's always talking about will and this will, that, and my will, and the will of the country and the nation, and kind of a, you know, this sort of eugenicist occultist thing, which also stems back to these British pederasts. That's all the same camp, and that's why I think that's why he was such a big admirer of that posse over there in Britain. He's had a natural affinity with them, and plus he was a megalomaniac, you know, a gigantic ego. So they just utilized him. He was an effective leader. He had a lot of charisma. I mean, just kind of a natural draw at that particular time, and he was the perfect personality for this operation. And so the secondary goals of supporting Hitler and a stronger Germany was stoking nationalist flames in Europe and countering Stalin Bonapartism. Hitler in the early years was a Zionist ally, and the Anglo-American Zionist banksters had no problem with putting Germany's Jewish population in motion and on reinforcing the U.S., Britain, and the early Israel project. So, I mean, the Israel project is also part of this, but we'll just keep moving the ball.
I have to comment on that briefly as someone who myself is very pro-Zionist. And that is that the Zionist movement and the goals of the Zionist movement was to ingather the world's Jewry into Israel. And in that capacity, they were willing to talk to any country that would help that, including Nazi Germany. I mean, I think they did negotiate with Nazi Germany to help transfer the Jews of Germany to Palestine. And all I can say is that I wish they'd been more successful in that regard. One of the reasons that the Jews did not get out of Europe is because of the Evian Conference, which was headed up by the United States, and which basically banned Jewish immigration into the rest of the world. It hemmed all the Jewish population of Europe inside Europe. There were countries, for example, I mean, in Central America and Latin America, that would have welcomed Jewish immigration, and they were told that they couldn't have it by this conference. And this conference was held in 1941 in France. So, my sense about that is that the motivation there on the part of the Zionists was simply to help Jews get out of those countries and get to Israel. That's what their movement was all about. I think it's nothing more, nothing less. Not to say that there weren't people in the Zionist movement then and today who aren't involved in this international movement. There certainly are, but I'm just talking about from their angle. I mean, the pure philosophy, the movement of Zionism was sovereignty in Israel.
You think the Zionists stymied the movement to other countries?
No, I think that, well, actually maybe. I mean, but I think the main thing was to get Jews to Israel. And
Right.
the main enemy in that, by the way, wasn't Germany, it was Britain and the United States.
Right, that was the goal, to get them to Israel, absolutely. But the thing is that real people on the ground have other ideas in mind. You know, I'm going to the United States, or I'm going to Argentina, or whatever. So that's that was pretty strong. That's a pretty strong factor. Once the Jews of Europe's got on, had an opportunity to go and get into motion as this event kind of built up. I'm just interested in your take of what, were the Jews of Europe stymied from going to Argentina? Or
no, they weren't. Not after Kristallnacht, and after it became obvious that the Jewish population of Europe was in great peril. There were major figures in the Jewish world that were trying to open up those countries, including Zev Jabotinsky, who was a Zionist, but at the same time he wanted to just encourage Jews to get the hell out of Poland, and he saw the writing on the wall. And I mean, the problem is that the Jews didn't believe in advance what was happening. They just thought it would all blow over, and they didn't. And he was screaming. And some of I think some of the Zionist leadership, like Ben Gurion, they didn't care as much. All they cared about was getting them to go to Israel. I think that's true. But, history is hindsight. I don't think any of them saw the nature of the Holocaust to the degree it happened. I think that nobody believed that was going to happen. Those who did believe it was going to happen wanted to just help the Jews get the hell out of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the United States today. I mean, people have a hard time leaving places that they've been established a long time. I've gotten the hell out, but
where are you, Russ?
Prague.
Oh, you're in Prague, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, so goes on. He says, little did they know that Hitler would jettison central banking, print his own money, and bring Germany back from the brink far too quickly. Mm-hmm. It seems the banksters then and now could set events in motion, but not really totally control them. Rokowski explains how the international bankers' plan went off the rail. He says, quote, Hitler, this uneducated elementary man, had restored, thanks to his natural intuition, even against the technical opinion of Schacht, an economic system of a very dangerous kind. Being illiterate in all economic theories and being guided only by the necessity, he removed, as we had done in the USSR, the private and international capital. This meant that he took over for himself the privilege of manufacturing money, and not only physical monies, but also financial ones. He took over the untouched machinery of falsification and put it to work for the benefit of the state. The 1930s British policy of appeasement was probably designed to encourage Hitler's expansionist tendency and to provoke war. Douglas Reed, the London Times correspondent in Berlin, was the first tipped off to something fishy when his newspaper suppressed his warnings of the Hitler menace. During the interrogation, Rokowski said, I consider the attack on the USS to be inevitable, USSR. Mm-hmm. His rationale, Hitler is impelled towards it by all these capitalist states, which allowed him to rearm and to take all the necessary and economic and strategical bases. This is quite obvious. The Hitlerist attack on USSR is, in addition, a dialectic necessity. Then I put Winter Watch note. That attack came in June 1941. One of the few predictions Rokowski missed is that Stalin would be eliminated within the year of the invasion. So that might have been some wishful thinking on his part.
Right. That didn't happen. Mm-hmm.
Rokowski advised his interrogator that Western bankers wanted to force a war between Germany and Russia, and that the best way of avoiding this was to sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler so as to get him tied up in wars with other countries. This suggestion was surprising, but made sense, and Stalin adopted it in August 1939. Incredibly, this is what Rokowski predicted in Red Symphony. He said, if the Soviets and Germany carve up Poland, which they did, Rokowski predicted the democracies would only declare war on one aggressor, and that would be Hitler.
Interesting. That's exactly what happened. You know,
Right.
we're told that World War II was started because of Hitler's invasion of Poland, and that's actually not quite true. It was Hitler's and Stalin's invasion and
Yes.
divvying up of Poland. And
then Uncle Joe ended up being the big hero of World War II, the guy that defeated Nazis.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
Anyway, that's pretty much the story. There's some interesting rabbit holes.
It's a pretty hot topic, you know. I mean, I have to say I'm a little nervous posting this on YouTube, but I'll have to decide that. This is hot stuff. Anyway, Russ, so talk a little bit about Winter Watch, where people can see it and whatnot.
Winterwatch.net, articles daily. We've got around the web where we kind of pick up a few stories that people don't always see, get them up there, expose them. So,
it's a great site. You know, I urge people to check it out. I do every day, and it's you get the news that is usually often censored by the mainstream press.
Yeah, and Charles, great interview today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Russ.
You're on a roll, buddy.
Yeah, well, I'm doing my best. All right, Russ, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, thanks a lot.